The diner smelled like burned coffee and old grease, the kind of place you only end up in when you're running from something or too hungover to care. Sully was the latter. He was halfway through a plate of rubbery eggs when she walked up to the booth. 86 years old, wearing a moth-eaten wool coat, staring dead at the skull patch on his leather cut. She didn't blink. "I need a son for the afternoon," she said. "Which one of you is available?" The vinyl booth of the Red Star Diner stuck to the back of Sully's thighs, peeling away with a wet, tearing sound every time he shifted his weight. It was Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. The days bled together when your primary calendar was measured in highway miles, and whatever cheap beer was on tap at the last roadhouse. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the grit of road dust still embedded in his pores. Across from him, Knox was attempting to drown a pale, limp waffle in synthetic maple syrup. To Sully's left, Rusty was asleep, his forehead resting against the smeared glass of the window, a steady, rattling snore vibrating up through the table. They wore their cuts, the heavy leather armor bearing the winged death's head of the Hell's Angels. It usually guaranteed them a wide berth. The waitress, a teenager with chipped black nail polish and tired eyes, had dropped their plates from a safe distance and hadn't been back to refill the mugs. Sully preferred it that way. His skull throbbed in time with the flickering neon sign outside the window, casting a sickly red glow over the salt shakers. "Eggs are cold," Knox muttered, chewing open-mouthed. "Eat 'em anyway," Sully grunted, staring at his coffee. The black liquid had a rainbow sheen of oil floating on the surface. He took a sip. It tasted like an ashtray and burnt copper. He set the mug down, wiping his mouth with the back of a scarred hand. That was when the smell hit him. It cut right through the airborne grease and stale sweat of the diner. Lavender and mothballs, a dry, papery scent that didn't belong anywhere near a highway truck stop. Sully didn't look up immediately. He just watched a shadow fall over his plate. Knox stopped chewing. Rusty snorted, shifting against the glass, and opened one bloodshot eye. Sully finally raised his head, his neck popping in protest. She was tiny, bird-boned. A stiff breeze coming off a passing 18-wheeler could have snapped her in half. She wore a faded blue wool coat that looked 50 years out of style, buttoned all the way up to a throat mapped with deep crossing wrinkles. Her hair was a thin white cloud, scalp showing through under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights. She clutched a worn leather clasp purse with both hands, the knuckles swollen and white. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard. They weren't clouded or wandering. They were a sharp, icy gray, and they were pinned entirely on Sully. She wasn't looking at the patches. She wasn't looking at the tattoos creeping up his neck or the heavy silver rings on his fingers. She looked right past the performance, right into the exhaustion beneath his eyes. "Can I help you, lady?" Sully asked. His voice was a rasp, rough as coarse grit sandpaper. He didn't mean it to sound polite, and it didn't. It sounded like a warning. The old woman didn't flinch. She took half a step closer, close enough that her wool coat brushed the edge of the laminate table. "Are you busy?" she asked. Her voice cracked, a reedy, brittle sound, but the volume was steady. Knox snorted a laugh, dropping his fork. "Busy doing what, Grandma? Organizing a bake sale?" "Yeah, we're slammed." She ignored Knox completely. Her eyes stayed locked on Sully. "I asked if you were busy." Sully leaned back, the leather of his cut creaking loudly in the sudden quiet of the diner. A few truck drivers a couple of booths down had stopped talking, watching the spectacle. The big scarred biker and the fragile pensioner. Sully hated an audience. "Look," Sully said, keeping his tone flat. "We're eating. You lost? Need a phone?" "I don't need a phone. I have a phone." She let go of the purse with one hand, reaching into the deep pocket of her coat. Instincts, honed by years of bad deals and sudden violence, made Sully tense. Knox's hand dropped below the table, but she didn't pull a weapon. She pulled out a crumpled wad of paper money. 20s, mostly, with a few 10s mixed in. They looked soft, like they'd been folded and unfolded 100 times. "I need a son for the afternoon," she said. her voice dropping a fraction, the icy facade cracking just enough to let a desperate, humiliating tremor leak through. Just for a few hours. I have $85. It's yours if you do it. Silence stretched over the booth, thick and uncomfortable. Rusty blinked slowly, looking from the money to the old woman, then to Sully. A son, Sully repeated slowly, testing the words. They tasted foreign on his tongue. Absurd. Lady, you're in the wrong place. We aren't an escort service. I don't need an escort. She placed the money on the edge of the table. It sat there next to the greasy salt shaker. I need someone to walk into a building with me, sit in a chair, nod when I introduce you, and leave. Introduce me to who? My sister, the old woman said. For a second her jaw tightened. She's dying, and she thinks I'm a failure. Sully stared at her. He felt a sudden, sharp annoyance. He didn't want to deal with this. He wanted his cold eggs, his terrible coffee, and the numbing vibration of his heavy custom V-twin on the open asphalt. He didn't want to look at the liver spots on her trembling hands or hear about dying sisters. It was too much reality, the wrong kind of reality, bleeding into his Tuesday. No, Sully said. He pushed the wad of cash back toward her with one finger. Put your money away before someone in here decides to take it from you. Go bother somebody else. He picked up his fork, stabbing it into the eggs to signify the conversation was over. But she didn't move. She stood there perfectly still, radiating that smell of lavender and dust. I don't have anyone else to ask, she said quietly. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, cold, hard, and pathetic. Sully chewed his eggs. They tasted like rubber and salt. He swallowed hard, keeping his eyes on his plate, willing her to walk away. The scrape of a heavy boot against the floor tiles told him Knox was shifting uncomfortably. Hey, lady, Knox said, his tone missing its usual sharp edge. We ain't exactly the country club type. Look at us. You take him in there, your sister's going to think you gave birth to a convict. She knows my son rides motorcycles, the old woman countered, not looking at Knox. She knows his name is Thomas. She hasn't seen him in 20 years. Her eyesight is terrible. The details won't matter. Where's Thomas? Sully asked. He hated himself for asking. Engaging meant he was slipping. Dead, she answered. Flat. No tears. Just a hollow word that hit the table with the weight of a stone. 6 years ago, liver failed. He drank too much. Sully stopped chewing. He glanced at Rusty, whose face had gone entirely blank. Sully knew 3 guys who had gone out the exact same way, skin turning yellow, eyes sinking in, vomiting blood until the machine just stopped. It was an ugly way to check out. I never told her, the woman continued, her fingers grazing the clasp of her purse again. I let her think he just didn't care enough to visit. Better she thought he was ungrateful than dead. But she's at the hospice facility on Ridge Road. The nurses called this morning. They said she won't make it through the night. She keeps asking to see my boy. Sully threw his fork down. It clattered loudly against the thick ceramic plate. And you walked into a diner, saw the Hells Angels, and thought, perfect? I saw 3 men who looked like they wouldn't ask too many questions for $85. She shot back, a sudden spark of defiance in her gray eyes. Sully actually barked a laugh at that. It was harsh and devoid of humor. He rubbed his face again. He was tired. His bones ached. He didn't feel an ounce of charity in his blood. He felt manipulated, cornered in a greasy spoon by a ghost of a woman holding crinkled cash. I'm not doing it, Sully said, leaning forward. It's a bad idea. She'll know. A mother knows her kid, even if she's blind. She isn't his mother, I am, the woman said, her voice rising an octave, a sudden edge of panic slicing through her composure. And I'm telling you, she won't know. Just sit there. Wear your jacket. Look like someone who's lived a hard life. Please. The word please sounded rusty, like she hadn't used it in a decade. Take the gig, Sully, Rusty mumbled from the window, his voice thick with sleep. I'm sick of looking at you. Go be a good boy for once. Sully glared at Rusty, then back at the old woman. Her hands were shaking badly now. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only the brittle reality of her age. If he said no, she would likely just stand here until her legs gave out, or she'd go try to solicit a trucker by the fuel pumps. He cursed softly, a foul string of syllables under his breath. He looked at the $85 on the table. It was pathetic. It wouldn't even fill the tank on his bike twice. "Keep your money," Sully growled. He slid out of the booth, his leather creaking, standing to his full height. He towered over her, a mountain of scuffed leather, denim, and ink. She had to tilt her head all the way back to look him in the eye. "You'll do it?" she asked, her breathing shallow. "I didn't say that." Sully reached into his pocket and threw a $20 bill onto the table to cover his untouched food. "What's your name?" "Margaret." "Margaret, I'm Sully." He didn't offer his hand. "You got a car, Margaret, or did you ride a broom here?" "I have a sedan. It's out back." "Good. You drive. I'll follow you." Margaret reached for the wad of cash on the table, her shaking fingers fumbling with the soft paper. "You need to take this. It's a business transaction." Sully looked down at her. He saw the pride holding her fragile spine rigid. If he did it for free, it was pity. If he took the money, he was an employee. She needed the illusion of control. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers brushing against her papery skin. He picked up one crumpled $10 bill and shoved it into the pocket of his cut. "Your retainer," Sully said, his voice flat. "Let's go before I sober up and change my mind." The parking lot behind the Red Star Diner was a cracked expanse of asphalt baking under the midday sun. Sully stood by his bike, a massive, stripped-down iron beast that smelled of hot oil and scorched metal. He watched Margaret shuffle toward a pale green mid-90s sedan. The car was missing a hubcap, and the rear bumper was held on by duct tape and rust. She opened the door, moving with agonizing slowness, and slid into the driver's seat. Sully threw his leg over the saddle of his bike. He turned the key and hit the starter. The heavy V-twin engine fired up with a concussive roar that rattled his teeth and vibrated up through his spine. He saw Margaret jump slightly in the driver's seat, her shoulders pulling up to her ears. "Idiot," Sully muttered to himself, kicking the bike into gear. He followed the pale green sedan out onto the two-lane highway. Margaret drove exactly 42 miles per hour in a 55 zone. Sully had to ride the clutch, the massive engine beneath him, chugging and complaining at the low speed, fighting the urge to stall. The wind whipped at his face, pulling the scent of pine and roadkill through his nose. He felt ridiculous. He was a patched member of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world, trailing a geriatric woman in a broken-down Buick like a heavily armed bodyguard protecting a bag of hard candies. His brothers were probably still at the diner, laughing themselves sick. He could already hear the jokes Knox was going to make at the clubhouse. He didn't care about Margaret's sister. He didn't care about her dead alcoholic son. He just wanted the miserable tension of the diner to end. He told himself he took the job because he was bored, because it was an excuse to get out of paying for Rusty's breakfast. But deep down, beneath the hardened leather and the cynicism, the lie bothered him. A mother lying to her dying sister about a son who had drank himself into the grave. It was a messy, pathetic human tragedy, and somehow he was steering his front wheel right into the middle of it. 30 minutes later, the green sedan pulled into the parking lot of the Sunrise Pines Care Center. It was a long, single-story brick building set back from the road, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns that looked artificial in their brightness. Sully parked the bike next to her car, kicking the stand down. The sudden silence when he cut the engine was heavy. Margaret was struggling to get out of her car. Sully walked over, stopping a few feet away, hooking his thumbs into his belt loops. He didn't offer a hand. He waited. Finally, she heaved herself out, clutching her purse to her chest. Her face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool breeze. "You all right?" Sully asked, not masking the irritation in his voice. "I'm fine," she snapped defensively. She smoothed down the front of her ancient wool coat. "Remember, your name is Thomas. You work in construction. That's why your hands look like that." She gestured vaguely to his tattooed knuckles. I know the gig, Margaret. Let's just get it over with. They walked toward the sliding glass doors. Sully shortened his stride so he wouldn't leave her behind. The doors parted with a soft hiss, and the atmosphere hit Sully like a physical wall. It was the smell. It was a violently sterile concoction of industrial bleach, lemon floor wax, and something underneath it all, something sour and decaying that the chemicals couldn't quite mask. It smelled like waiting. It smelled like the end of the line. Sully hated hospitals. He hated places where the air was filtered and the lighting made everyone look like a corpse. His jaw tight, teeth grinding together. A nurse in floral scrubs at the front desk looked up as they entered. Her professional smile faltered instantly when she saw Sully. Her eyes darted to the leather cut, the skull patch, the heavy boots tracking diner dust onto her clean linoleum floor. She reached subtly for the phone on her desk. Margaret stepped in front of Sully, her small frame attempting to shield him. I'm Margaret Higgins. I'm here to see my sister Eleanor Davis. Room 114. I brought my son. The nurse swallowed hard, her hand hovering over the receiver. She looked from the fragile old woman to the towering, scarred man standing behind her. He's visiting? The nurse asked, her voice squeaking slightly. Yes, Margaret said sharply, her tone brooking no argument. Which way is 114? Down the hall, take a left, the nurse murmured, pulling her hand away from the phone. She's not very responsive today, Mrs. Higgins, just so you know. Margaret didn't reply. She just started walking. Sully followed, the heavy thud of his boots echoing loudly in the quiet corridor. They passed open doors. Sully caught glimpses of skeletal figures propped up in beds, staring blankly at silent televisions. The faint, rhythmic beeping of monitors hummed in the background. It made his skin crawl. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to get back on the asphalt, twist the throttle, and outrun the scent of bleach. But he kept walking. He watched the back of Margaret's faded blue coat, noticing how her narrow shoulders were trembling violently now. The tough exterior she had used in the diner was evaporating in the sterile hallway. She wasn't a commanding presence anymore. She was just an old, terrified woman walking toward a ghost. They reached the door of 114. Margaret stopped abruptly. Sully almost ran into her. She stood outside the door, staring at the room number placard. Her hands gripped the leather purse so hard her knuckles looked like polished bone. Sully stood behind her, shifting his weight. A minute passed. Then 2. You going in, or are we going to stand out here until we both die of old age? Sully asked quietly. Margaret let out a ragged, shaking breath. I don't know if I can. Sully looked down at her. He saw a tear slide down her cheek, disappearing into the deep wrinkles near her mouth. He felt that sharp annoyance again, mixing dangerously with something that felt uncomfortably like pity. He didn't comfort her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He reached out and pushed the heavy wooden door open with the flat of his hand. You paid me $10, Margaret, Sully said, his voice a low, rough rumble in the quiet hall. I'm clocking in. After you. Margaret looked back at him, her gray eyes swimming. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and stepped into the room. Sully took a deep breath of the bleach-scented air, squared his broad shoulders under his leather cut, and followed his mother inside. The door clicked shut behind them, cutting off the fluorescent hum of the hallway. Room 114 was stiflingly hot, the air baked dry by baseboard heaters cranked far past comfort. It smelled of medicinal paste, stale urine, and the sickly sweet odor of decaying tissue. It was the smell of a body shutting down, room by room, until only the basement was left. Sully stopped just inside the threshold. The heat immediately clamped around his throat, making the heavy leather of his cut feel like a suffocating second skin. He shifted his weight, his heavy engineer boots squeaking loudly against the waxed linoleum. The sound was deafening in the quiet. In the center of the room sat a narrow mechanical bed, elevated at the head. A woman lay there, though lay implied a resting weight. She looked more like she had been draped over the mattress, a collection of sharp angles and loose, translucent skin. Eleanor Davis was a ghost actively haunting her own remains. A clear plastic tube looped over her ears, feeding into her nostrils. Next to the bed, an oxygen concentrator the size of a mini fridge sat on the floor, cycling with a rhythmic, mechanical shh, clack, shh, clack. It sounded like artificial breathing. Margaret hadn't moved past the foot of the bed. She stood frozen, her knobby fingers still strangling the clasp of her ancient purse. Her jaw trembled. She was staring at her sister, but Sully could tell she wasn't seeing the woman in the bed. She was seeing the years they'd spent together, the arguments, the shared kitchens, the life that was currently evaporating in this hot, sour room. "Margaret," Sully muttered, his voice a low, rough rumble. He nudged her elbow with the back of his hand. "You're on the clock." Margaret jerked as if he'd shocked her. She sucked in a shaky breath, forcing her shoulders down, and shuffled around the side of the bed. "Ellie?" Margaret said. Her voice was too loud for the small room, brittle and forced. "Ellie, wake up. You have company." The figure on the bed didn't stir immediately. The oxygen machine cycled twice more. Shh, clack, shh, clack. Then, slowly, Eleanor's head rolled on the thin pillow. Her eyelids, bruised a deep purple and thin as wet paper, fluttered upward. Her eyes were milky, heavily clouded with cataracts, the irises a washed-out, pale blue that seemed to look right through the ceiling tiles. "Margaret?" Eleanor's voice was a wet rattle, pushing past phlegm and exhaustion. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "I'm here, Ellie," Margaret said, stepping closer, though she notably kept her hands clamped to her purse, refusing to touch the bed rails. "I brought him. I brought Thomas." The change in Eleanor was immediate and terrifying. A surge of desperate, frantic energy animated her skeletal frame. Her hands, previously resting limp on the blanket, twitched and rose. The fingers were twisted with arthritis, the knuckles swollen into hard knots. She pawed blindly at the empty air beside the bed. "Tommy? My Tommy?" she gasped, her breathing instantly becoming shallow and rapid, the plastic tubing pulling taut against her face. Margaret turned to look at Sully. Panic was entirely taking over her features. She looked small, terrified, and utterly out of her depth. She gave him a frantic, jerky nod. "Do it!" Sully felt a spike of pure, unadulterated annoyance. He didn't want to step forward. He wanted to back out of the room, get on his bike, and ride until the highway dissolved into the ocean. The heat of the room was making him sweat, a cold, clammy prickle at the base of his neck. His chest felt tight. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't a tense standoff with a rival club where the rules were written in violence and posturing. This was an intimate, messy human tragedy, and he was trespassing. He swallowed hard. It tasted like ash. He took 2 heavy steps forward, closing the distance to the side of the bed. "I'm here," Sully said. He didn't try to soften his voice. He couldn't. It came out exactly as it always did, a deep gravel road rasp roughened by cheap cigars and years of yelling over the roar of a V-twin engine. Eleanor froze. Her milky eyes darted wildly, trying to lock onto the source of the sound. Her blind gaze settled somewhere around Sully's chest. "Tommy?" she whispered again, the frantic energy faltering, replaced by a thread of confusion. "You sound... your voice." Margaret made a strangled little noise in the back of her throat, taking a half step backward. She was failing. The grand deception was going to fall apart in the first 30 seconds, because Sully sounded like a felon, not a beloved nephew. Sully glared at Margaret, silently cursing her, her $10, and her dead son. He looked back down at the dying woman. He had to plug the hole. "It's the dust, Aunt Ellie," Sully lied. The words felt like broken glass in his mouth. He leaned over the bed rails, forcing himself to inhabit the space. "Been working a demolition site out west for a month. Concrete dust tears up the throat. Sounds worse than it is." Eleanor's clouded eyes widened slightly. The explanation seemed to slot perfectly into the fiction Margaret had built for her. Construction, hard labor, It justified the rough edges. "Oh," Eleanor breathed, the tension bleeding out of her raised hands. "Oh, my boy, my sweet boy. Come here. Let me see you." She wasn't asking to see him with her eyes. Her twisted, trembling hands reached out again, patting the empty air directly in front of Sully's torso. Sully stood perfectly still, his muscles locked. He looked at those frail, searching hands. One wrong move, one heavy-handed touch, and he felt like he would snap her wrists. He looked over at Margaret. She was staring at the floor, crying silently, completely useless. Shh, clack, shh, clack. Sully let out a slow, controlled breath through his nose. He uncrossed his arms. He reached out with his right hand, a massive, scarred slab of meat and bone, knuckles thick with calluses, the back of his hand covered in a faded, blurry tattoo of a spider web. He moved slowly, deliberately, and gently closed his fingers around Eleanor's hovering hands. The physical shock of her skin nearly made Sully pull away. Eleanor was freezing. Despite the oppressive heat baking the small hospice room, her hands felt like they had been pulled from a cooler. The skin was impossibly thin, lacking any elasticity, sliding loosely over the sharp ridges of her bones. She possessed absolutely no body fat, no warmth. It was like holding a bundle of cold, dry twigs wrapped in parchment paper. The moment his thick fingers engulfed hers, Eleanor's grip tightened with a desperate, surprising strength. She clung to him like a drowning woman pulling herself onto a raft. "Tommy?" she sighed. It was a long, shuddering exhalation that smelled of sour milk and old copper. Sully stood there, his back aching from stooping over the low bed. He didn't know what to do with his face, so he kept it blank, staring at the thin white hair plastered to her scalp. Eleanor's thumbs weakly stroked the back of his hand. She felt the thick, raised scars across his knuckles. She felt the heavy, chunky silver rings on his index and middle fingers, one a flattened horseshoe, the other a grinning skull that had caught more than a few teeth in its time. She paused, her weak fingers tracing the skull ring. "You're still wearing those awful rings," she murmured, a faint ghost of a smile pulling at the corner of her cracked lips. "Your mother always hated them." Sully's eyes darted to Margaret. Margaret had stopped crying. She was staring at Sully with wide, terrified eyes. Neither of them knew if the real Thomas had worn rings. It was a lucky blind guess by a dying woman trying to connect the sensory input of a stranger to the memory of a ghost. "Yeah," Sully grunted, keeping his voice low, leaning into the lie. "Can't take 'em off anymore. Knuckles got too thick." "Hard work," Eleanor whispered approvingly. Her thumb kept rubbing the cold silver of the skull. "Margaret said you were building houses, real houses for families. That's good, Tommy. That's honest work." Sully felt a strange, uncomfortable twisting in his gut. Honest work. The last thing he built was a makeshift barricade out of pool tables during a turf dispute in Reno. He squeezed her cold hands very gently, terrified of crushing them. "It pays the rent," Sully said. It was a safe, generic answer. "Sit," Eleanor commanded weakly, tugging at his hand. "Sit down. My neck hurts looking up." There was a cheap, vinyl-covered visitor's chair shoved into the corner, currently acting as a resting place for a stack of folded hospital blankets. Sully looked at it, then at Margaret. Margaret finally moved. She hurried over, scooped the blankets into her arms, and dragged the chair to the side of the bed. It scraped loudly against the linoleum. Sully lowered his massive frame into the chair. It creaked dangerously under his weight, the vinyl compressing flat against the metal frame. He was now at eye level with the bed. He was still holding Eleanor's hands. He didn't know how to let go without seeming cruel, so he simply rested his forearms on the metal bed rail, anchoring her hands between them. "You haven't come to see me," Eleanor said. The faint smile vanished, replaced by a raw, naked hurt that made Sully want to look away. "It's been so long, Tommy. I thought you were angry with me about what happened at Thanksgiving all those years ago." Sully's mind raced. Thanksgiving. Years ago. He had no script for this. He had no idea what the real Thomas had done or what Eleanor had done to him. He was flying blind in a minefield of a dead man's family trauma. He looked at Margaret for help, but she was useless, standing near the oxygen machine, her face buried in a crumpled tissue. I wasn't angry, Sully lied, lowering his chin, letting the gravel in his voice do the heavy lifting. I was busy. The work takes you where it takes you. Long hours, bad roads. He wasn't entirely lying about that part. But you never called, Eleanor pressed, her milky eyes searching his face, looking for features she couldn't see. Your mother said you lost your phone. But for years, Tommy? For years? The desperation in her voice was a physical weight. It pressed down on Sully's chest. He felt a sudden, sharp flash of anger, not at Eleanor, but at the dead man whose place he was taking. What kind of coward drinks himself to death and leaves this kind of wreckage behind? And what kind of mother covers it up with a lie so flimsy it collapses the moment it's spoken aloud? Sully leaned forward, bringing his face closer to hers, blocking out the sterile room, the blinking monitors, and Margaret's quiet sobbing. I was a mess, Aunt Ellie, Sully said. He stopped acting. He reached into his own dark well, pulling up the memories of his 20s, the years lost to cheap speed and bad decisions, the bridges he had burned so thoroughly they were still smoking. I wasn't right in the head for a long time. I was angry. I was drinking too much, doing stupid things with stupid people. He felt Eleanor's hand stiffen slightly in his grasp. I didn't call because I was ashamed, Sully continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I didn't want you to hear me like that. I didn't want you to know what a wreck I'd become, so I stayed away. It was easier than letting you see me fail. The room was dead silent, save for the relentless shh, clack of the machine. Margaret had stopped crying. She was staring at Sully, her jaw slack. Eleanor let out a long, ragged sigh. The tension drained out of her thin arms. Her head sank deeper into the thin pillow. Oh, Tommy, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. You foolish, foolish boy. Did you really think I cared about you failing? The vinyl chair dug into the backs of Sully's thighs, a dull ache that he welcomed as a distraction from the crushing atmosphere of the room. He kept his eyes locked on the white cotton blanket covering Eleanor's chest, watching the shallow, rapid rise and fall of her breathing. She had accepted his lie perfectly because it wasn't a lie at all. It was the truth, just borrowed from a different broken man. I know it's hard out there, Eleanor murmured, her eyes slipping shut, the effort of staying awake clearly draining her rapidly dwindling reserves. Your father, he had the same darkness in him. Always thought he had to be perfect, or he was nothing at all. He drank to turn off the noise, too. Sully swallowed. The real Thomas's father was a drunk. Add another piece to the pathetic puzzle. He wondered if Margaret had driven him to it, or if he'd ruined Margaret. It didn't matter. The cycle was identical in every dirty town Sully had ever ridden through. I'm better now, Sully said quietly. He felt a bizarre compulsion to comfort her, to offer this dying woman a clean ending she didn't actually have. I dried out, got my union card, got my head straight. I'm okay now, Aunt Ellie. Eleanor smiled. It was a genuine, beautiful thing that briefly erased the pain from her sunken features. She squeezed his thick fingers again. I knew you would figure it out, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hissing oxygen. I told your mother. I said, Margaret, leave him be. He's got a good heart under all that anger. He'll find his way home when he's ready. Sully felt a sudden, violent restriction in his throat. A hot, tight knot formed right at his Adam's apple, making it hard to draw breath. He clamped his jaw shut, the muscles jumping in his cheeks. He's got a good heart. Nobody had ever said that about Sully. His own mother, a bitter woman who worked the graveyard shift at a meatpacking plant, had looked at him when he was 16, handed him his birth certificate, and told him to get the hell out of her trailer before he ended up in prison or a body bag. He had spent the next 30 years making sure her prediction came true, embracing the violence, wearing the skull patch like a warning label to the rest of civil society. He was Sully. He broke jaws. He collected debts with a heavy steel wrench. He lived by a code written by outlaws. But sitting in this stifling, bleached room, Holding the freezing hands of a dying stranger, the armor felt completely useless. It felt heavy and absurd. "I'm sorry I took so long," Sully choked out. The words bypassed his brain entirely, pulled from somewhere deep in his chest by the sheer gravity of the room. Eleanor's blind eyes remained closed. Her breathing was slowing down, the gaps between each rattling inhalation growing longer. "You're here now," she breathed. "That's all that matters. You came to see me off." "Yeah," Sully whispered. "I'm here." "Are you taking care of your mother?" Eleanor asked, her voice fading, slipping towards sleep or something deeper. Sully glanced over his shoulder. Margaret was leaning against the wall near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around her own fragile ribcage. She looked ancient. She looked utterly destroyed, bearing the weight of her sister's impending death and the massive, crushing guilt of her own lies. "Yeah," Sully said, looking back at Eleanor. "I'll look out for her." "Good boy." Eleanor sighed. Her grip on his hands went completely slack. The twisted fingers uncurled, coming to rest against his knuckles. Her jaw went slightly slack, and her breathing settled into a shallow, wet rhythm. She was asleep, or unconscious. Sully didn't know enough about dying to tell the difference. He waited 3 full minutes, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, listening to the oxygen machine. Shh, clack, shh, clack. When he was sure she wasn't going to wake up again, he very gently slid his hands out from under hers. He placed her frail hands delicately back on top of the white blanket. He stood up. The joints in his knees popped loudly. He felt exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had nothing to do with physical labor. He felt like he had just run a marathon in a straitjacket. He turned around. Margaret was staring at him. Her gray eyes were completely stripped of the icy defiance she had shown in the diner. There was only naked vulnerability left. Sully didn't say a word. He walked past the mechanical bed, past the humming oxygen machine, and stepped out into the hallway. The contrast was staggering. The hallway was freezing cold, heavily air-conditioned, the bright fluorescent lights blinding after the dimness of the room. Sully stood by the door, sucking in lungfuls of the sterile, bleach-scented air, trying to clear the smell of decay from his nose. A moment later, Margaret shuffled out of the room. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind her until it clicked into the latch. She leaned heavily against the wall, dropping her purse to the floor. It hit the linoleum with a dull thud. She put her face in her hands and began to weep. It wasn't the quiet, dignified crying she had done inside the room. It was ugly, racking sobs that shook her entire tiny frame, a dam breaking after decades of holding back the water. Sully stood there, massive and terrifying in his leathers, watching a frail old woman fall apart in a brightly lit corridor. Nurses at the far end of the hall looked up from their charts, their expressions a mix of professional concern and wary apprehension at the giant biker standing over the grieving woman. Sully let her cry for exactly 60 seconds. Then he moved. He took a heavy step forward, bending down to pick up her scuffed leather purse. He held it out to her. "Walk, Margaret," Sully said, his voice flat, devoid of any comfort or softness. Margaret looked up, her face wet, her eyes red and puffy. She stared at the purse in his massive hand, then up at his completely impassive face. "What?" she choked out. "I said walk," Sully repeated, shoving the purse gently against her chest until she instinctively grabbed it. "You don't break down here. The gig is over. You pay me, and we leave. Keep your spine straight until you get to your car." He turned on his heel, the heavy leather of his jacket squeaking, and began walking down the hallway toward the sliding glass doors, his boots thudding a slow, steady rhythm on the floor. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He knew exactly how much pride the old woman had left, and he knew it was the only thing that would get her out of the building. The automatic doors slid open, and the transition from the refrigerated, sterile air of the hospice to the baking afternoon heat of the parking lot hit Sully like a physical blow. The air outside smelled of melting tar, exhaust fumes, and dry grass. It was the scent of the living world, harsh and unforgiving. Sully didn't slow his pace until his heavy boots hit the cracked asphalt beside his bike. The massive iron machine was radiating heat, the black leather saddle hot enough to burn through denim. He stopped, hooked his thumbs into his belt loops, and turned back. Margaret was 50 feet behind him, moving at a glacial pace. She had both arms wrapped around her purse, holding it tight to her chest like a shield. Her head was bowed. The brutal afternoon sun beat down on her thin, white hair and the heavy wool coat she stubbornly refused to take off. Sully waited. He watched a bead of sweat crawl down the side of his own neck, soaking into the collar of his shirt. He didn't go back to help her. He knew if he offered his hand now, she would shatter completely. The cruelty of making her walk alone was the only scaffolding keeping her upright. When she finally reached the pale green sedan, she stopped. She didn't look up at his face. She stared at the center of his chest, her breathing shallow and ragged, pulling the hot air into her failing lungs. "Open the car, Margaret," Sully said. His voice was a flat, grating rumble. Her hands trembled violently as she fumbled with the latch of her purse. She dug past a crumpled tissue, a ring of keys, and a plastic pillbox. She pulled out the wad of worn, soft bills. She didn't bother counting it. She simply held the entire clump of paper out toward him. $75, Margaret whispered. Her voice was entirely devoid of the sharp, commanding edge she had wielded in the diner. It was hollowed out. Sully looked at the money. The bills were incredibly old, the edges frayed and tearing. He reached out and took the cash. The exchange was brief, but their fingers brushed. Her skin had warmed up slightly in the sun, but the papery fragility remained. "Transaction complete," Sully stated. He shoved the wad of bills into the front pocket of his cut, not breaking eye contact. Margaret finally raised her chin. Her eyes were bloodshot, the gray irises swimming in unshed tears. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the heavy brow, the jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, the ink bleeding up the side of his neck. "You didn't have to say those things," she said softly. To her, about getting better. "She needed a clean exit," Sully replied, turning his body toward his bike. "I gave her one. Don't read into it." "Thomas never got better," Margaret continued, as if she hadn't heard him. She leaned against the rusted door of her car. "He died angry. He died hating me and hating himself. I sat in his hospital room for 3 days watching his skin turn yellow, and he never said a single kind word to me. Not one." Sully paused, his hand resting on the hot rubber of his left hand grip. He didn't want to hear this. He had clocked out. The $85 was in his pocket, severing the contract. "He was a drunk, Margaret," Sully said harshly, staring at the chrome reflection of the sun on his headlight. "Drunks don't have kind words. They only have whatever gets them the next pour. It wasn't about you." "I know," she breathed. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the dust on her cheek. "But she didn't know that. You gave her the boy she remembered. I don't know how to thank you." "You already did, with cash." Sully swung his leg over the saddle. The suspension groaned under his weight. He reached down and violently kicked the starter pedal. The heavy V-twin engine exploded into life. The sheer volume of the exhaust shattered the quiet of the parking lot, echoing off the brick walls of the hospice. It was a violent, obnoxious roar that rattled the windows of the pale green sedan. Margaret flinched, stepping back. Sully didn't look at her again. He kicked the bike into gear, the transmission engaging with a heavy metallic clunk. He twisted the throttle, feeling the power surge through the frame, and pulled out of the parking space. He left her standing there in the heat, an old woman entirely alone in the wake of his noise. He hit the highway and opened the throttle wide. The wind screamed against his ears, tearing at his clothes, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the memory of Eleanor's freezing hands clinging to his rings. He pushed the bike faster, weaving dangerously through the sparse afternoon traffic, leaning hard into the curves until the metal pegs sparked against the asphalt. He wanted the adrenaline to burn the encounter out of his system. He wanted the danger of the road to remind him exactly who and what he was. But every time he looked down at his left hand, pulling the clutch, he saw the silver skull ring, and he felt the ghost of a dying woman's thumb tracing the metal, forgiving him for sins he hadn't even committed. The Iron Horse Saloon was located on the absolute outer edge of the county line, sitting in a dirt lot surrounded by dead scrub oak and rusted-out car frames. It was windowless, smelling perpetually of stale beer, bleach, and the metallic tang of dried blood. It was the club's unofficial living room. Sully killed the engine out front, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He sat on the bike for a long moment, staring at the scarred wooden door of the bar. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the dirt. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. When he pushed the door open, the darkness inside was absolute. It took several seconds for his eyes to adjust to the dim neon glow of the beer signs behind the bar. The midday crowd consisted of 4 men. Knox was at the pool table, chalking a cue with violent, jerky motions. Rusty was slumped in a booth, nursing a pint of dark liquid. Beside him sat Wyatt, a heavily built man with a braided beard and a fresh black eye, dealing a deck of greasy cards onto the scarred wood. Wyatt looked up as Sully approached the bar. "Well, look who survived the nursing home. You bring us any hard candies, Sully? Maybe some butterscotch?" Knox laughed, a sharp barking sound. He lined up a shot and sent the cue ball cracking into the pack. "I told him he was going to end up changing a bedpan. You change a bedpan, brother? Because if you smell like piss, you can't sit here." Sully ignored them. He walked heavily to the bar and pulled out a stool. It groaned in protest. The bartender, a gaunt man named Scully who wore a filthy apron, didn't ask for an order. He simply reached under the counter, pulled up a bottle of cheap rye whiskey, and poured 3 fingers into a smudged glass. Sully picked it up and threw it back in one swallow. The liquor burned like battery acid going down his throat, a sharp, aggressive heat that pooled in his stomach. He slammed the glass back down. "Hit it again," Sully rasped. Scully obliged, pouring another measure. Knox leaned on his pool cue, watching Sully's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The mocking grin slowly faded from his face. Knox was a violent sociopath, but he had survived this long by knowing how to read a room, and reading Sully was a survival skill. "Hey," Knox said, his tone dropping the humor. "You good?" Sully didn't turn around. He stared at his own face in the mirror. The jagged scar, the broken nose, the hollow exhaustion under his eyes. He looked exactly like the thug everyone expected him to be. "I'm fine," Sully growled. "Just thirsty." He picked up the second glass, but he didn't drink it immediately. He rolled the warm liquid around, watching it cling to the sides of the glass. His skin was crawling. The bar, the only sanctuary he had known for 20 years, suddenly felt suffocating. The smell of the stale beer made his stomach churn. The sound of Wyatt shuffling the cards grated against his nerves. He looked at the patches on the backs of his brother's cuts, the winged skull, a symbol of absolute rebellion, of existing outside the rules of polite society. It felt like a costume. Sully looked down at his hands, resting on the sticky varnish of the bar. His knuckles were bruised, a permanent purple-yellow discoloration from decades of brawling. But all he could feel was the weight of Eleanor's brittle, frozen fingers. "I knew you would figure it out. He's got a good heart under all that anger." Sully gripped the whiskey glass so hard he thought it might shatter. A good heart. It was a joke. It was a delusion concocted by a dying brain trying to find peace in a pitch-black room. He had ruined people. He had broken bones and destroyed property and laughed while he did it. He had left his own mother to rot in a trailer park without looking back. But in that stifling room, for exactly 20 minutes, he had been a savior. He had offered absolution. He had given a woman permission to die without the agonizing weight of a son's hatred. The lie had been entirely pure. Wyatt threw his cards down on the table in disgust. "Man, this deck is marked. Hey, Sully, what actually happened with the old bat? She make you listen to a phonograph or something?" Sully turned slowly on the stool. He locked eyes with Wyatt. His expression was completely dead, devoid of any camaraderie or brotherhood. "She paid me $85 to watch her sister die," Sully said. His voice wasn't a yell, but it carried through the bar with the weight of a physical blow. The silence that followed was absolute. Knox slowly lowered his pool cue to the floor. Rusty stopped mid-sip, his eyes darting between Sully and Wyatt. The casual brutality of the club had a ceiling, and staring death in the face in a sterile hospice room wasn't something you joked about. "Damn," Wyatt muttered, looking away first, suddenly intensely interested in his boots. "That's heavy." "Yeah," Sully said quietly. He turned back to the bar. He picked up his whiskey and drank it. It tasted like nothing. He sat there for another hour as the sun went down, and the bar filled with the evening crowd. The noise level rose, the jukebox blared heavy metal, and the smell of cheap weed drifted in from the back patio. Sully sat in the middle of it, completely isolated. He was surrounded by his chosen family, surrounded by noise and violence and chaos, and he had never felt more entirely alone in his life. It was past midnight when Sully finally walked out of the Iron Horse. The temperature had dropped significantly, a chill wind sweeping off the desert floor, kicking up dust devils in the parking lot. He hadn't gotten drunk. He had matched his brother's drink for drink, but the alcohol seemed to burn off before it hit his brain, leaving him in a state of hyper-aware sobriety. He started his bike, the engine idling with a low, threatening throb. He pulled out onto the main highway, heading away from town. He didn't have a destination. He just needed the forward momentum. He rode for 40 miles, letting the vibration of the engine numb his muscles, watching the white lines of the highway flash by in the glare of his headlight. Eventually, the glow of a 24-hour truck stop appeared on the horizon. Sully geared down, pulling the heavy bike into the massive parking lot filled with idling 18-wheelers. He parked near the entrance of the diner attached to the fuel station, a place completely identical in spirit to the one he had been in that morning. He walked inside. The harsh fluorescent lights assaulted his eyes. The diner was mostly empty, save for 2 truckers sleeping in a back booth and a solitary waitress leaning heavily against the counter, staring blankly at the spinning pie case. She looked to be in her early 50s. Her uniform was stained with coffee, and the lines around her mouth spoke of double shifts and achy joints. She looked up as Sully entered, her eyes narrowing slightly at the leather cut and the imposing frame, but she was too tired to be truly frightened. "Sit anywhere," she said, her voice flat. "Coffee's fresh." Sully slid into a booth near the window. The vinyl didn't stick to his legs this time. The air conditioning was cranked too high, raising goosebumps on his forearms. The waitress walked over carrying a brown carafe and a thick ceramic mug. She flipped the mug over and filled it without asking. "You want food or just the caffeine?" she asked, pulling a small notepad from her apron. "Just the coffee," Sully said. She nodded, turning to walk away. "Wait," Sully said. She stopped, turning back with a sigh, expecting a complaint or a lewd comment. "Yeah?" Sully reached into the front pocket of his cut. His thick fingers closed around the crumpled, worn wad of bills Margaret had given him. He pulled it out. The $10 retainer and the 75 in worn 20s and 5s. It felt incredibly light in his massive hand. He looked at the money, then up at the waitress. He saw the exhaustion in her posture, the cheap, unsupportive shoes she was wearing, the faint tremor in her hand as she held the carafe. He took the entire wad of cash and dropped it onto the laminate table. It hit the surface with a soft, pathetic thwack. "What's this?" the waitress asked, staring at the money, then up at his face. "Keep the change," Seeley said. She frowned, stepping closer, looking at the denomination. "Mr. Coffee is $2? There's almost $100 here." "85, Sully corrected her quietly. "It's $85. "I can't take this," she said, shaking her head, taking a step back as if the money were contaminated. "You trying to buy something else?" "I don't want anything," Sully said. His voice was exhausted, the gravel scraped completely bare. "It's dirty money. It's heavy. I just need to leave it somewhere. Buy some new shoes, pay a light bill. I don't care, just take it." The waitress stared at him for a long, calculating moment. She looked at the scars on his face, the skull ring on his hand, the aggressive leather of his vest. Then she looked at the crumpled bills. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and swept the $85 off the table, shoving it deep into the pocket of her apron. "Suit yourself, biker," she muttered, though her voice lacked its previous edge. Thanks. She walked away, retreating behind the counter, leaving him alone in the booth. Sully wrapped both of his hands around the hot ceramic mug. The heat seeped into his thick, calloused palms, finally driving out the lingering phantom chill of Eleanor's fingers. He stared out the window into the blackness of the parking lot. He didn't experience a grand epiphany. He wasn't going to turn into his cut, find a 9-to-5 job, or start going to church. Tomorrow, he would wake up, get on his bike, and ride back into the violent, messy reality he had built for himself. He was Sully, a patched member of the Hells Angels, and that wasn't going to change. But as he lifted the mug to his lips, inhaling the bitter steam of the black coffee, he knew something small had shifted. A microscopic fracture had opened in the armor. He had walked into a room as a monster, and for 20 minutes he had allowed himself to be a son. And out there, in the dark, an old woman named Margaret was sleeping in an empty house, carrying one less lie to the grave. Sully took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like ash and burnt copper. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't hate the taste. Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are the ones we borrow from strangers. And redemption doesn't always look like a halo. Sometimes it looks like a bruised knuckle and $85 left on a diner table. If Sully's quiet surrender and Margaret's desperate gamble resonated with you, drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on this unlikely connection. If this story made you feel something real, hit the like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with someone who appreciates gritty, human storytelling, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the shadows of the human heart. Ride safe, and see you in the next one.